In his book Reorient, economist Andre Gunder Frank turns received Eurocentric historiography and social theory upside down by using a globological perspective. Under the assumptions of this alternative point of view, Frank asserts that Asia, and not Europe, held center stage for most of early modern history. Indeed, evidence from China, including religion, art, text, and material culture, have long attested to the extent and scope of interconnectedness that existed among Asian states much prior to contact with Western Europe. Since the 3rd century BCE, the Silk Road connected the economies and cultures of various disparate states of continental Asia. The history of the spread of Buddhism to China from India parallels the history of the Silk Road trade. This close link between Buddhism and commerce is no coincidence. Back in India, the entrenched caste system ascribed status to individuals at birth. Despite the merchants' achieved wealth, they resided in a rigidly structured society wherein social mobility was unfathomable. In the 6th century BCE, these economically powerful but socially inferior Indian merchants took to Buddhism as an alternative to caste-based Brahminist beliefs. By the time that Buddhism was adopted by Indian rulers and became institutionalized, religious missions were sent beyond India, reaching China by the 3rd century BCE. Today, Buddhism is the most practiced religion in China. Its success and sustainability through time is partly the legacy of caravan merchants who reinforced the mission effort by practicing the religion and consolidating its presence along the Silk Road. As the frescoes at the Mogao grottos depict, commercial encounters are not carried out in a vacuum. In addition to trade goods, they may also involve the diffusion of cultural elements. Aside from religion, the integration of foreign traditions manifested in the routine of secular day-to-day life. Evidence of polo in China appears in artistic representations dating back to the Tang dynasty. The sport's origins is traced much earlier to Persia. One account of its spread to China describes that it was introduced to the Tang society by the son of the Sasanian emperor, who served on the imperial court. In turn, the Chinese would later introduce the game to Korea and Japan. The Tang society is well known for its cosmopolitan character. Both the people and cultural practices of foreign civilizations were seamlessly integrated into Tang society. The Nestorian stele, established in the 8th century, recognizes the presence of Christians. A sizable Arab and Persian merchant community also existed at major trading hubs. As this tombstone shows, when foreigners passed away, they were mourned and commemorated as members of the community. The presence of foreigners is also evident in the mortuary rituals of the imperial family. These ceramic figurines retrieved from an imperial tomb are grave goods, also called mingqi. One is a court official, and the other a military officer. When compared to Tang representation of Han Chinese ethnicity, the marked difference in appearance possibly indicates that these figurines depict subjects of Central Asian heritage. But more importantly, they demonstrate the social mobility and extent of tolerance toward non-Chinese individuals during this period, such that foreigners could serve as high-ranking courtiers. In this social milieu, intermarriage was common in mainstream society. Historical records show that marriage between Han women and foreign men was legally sanctioned. In fact, it was practiced by the imperial government as a mode of foreign diplomacy. Political alliance through marriage was known as he qin. This painting depicts the story of Princess Wen-cheng, who was married off to the king of Tibet. Princess Wen-cheng was the niece of Tang Emperor Taizong, 8 of whose own 21 daughters also ended up married to non-Chinese husbands. In conjunction with the land paths, Asia was also interconnected by a maritime Silk Road. This route commenced around the 1st century during the Han Dynasty and primarily linked the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. Shipwrecks like the Bali Tong and Nanhai No. 1 demonstrate the continuity of contact sustained among Asian and Middle Eastern civilizations since the establishment of the land-based Silk Road in the 3rd century BCE. As consistent with Frank's reorientation of global economic history, these wreckages remind us how, by the time the Europeans entered the picture, contact among Asian and Middle Eastern societies were already well established. Direct trade with Europe began only after the 16th century, when the Portuguese sailed around Africa and discovered a path to the Indian Ocean and East Asia. The age of discovery was itself fueled by a demand for Asian trade commodities. Even after the entree and subsequent rise of the Westerners in the global trade market, this Asian centrality remained, as will be demonstrated by the general direction of cultural diffusion during this early modern period. The remainder of this presentation will explore the extent of contact between China and Europe in terms of material culture and language from the 16th to 19th centuries. European demand for Chinese porcelain is well documented, not just by physical presence of Chinese ceramics in foreign contexts, but also demonstrated through the stylistic emulation of domestically produced European goods. Reaching the Chinese coast in 1514, the Portuguese were the first among the Westerners to establish direct trade relations with China. During this time, piracy in the South China Seas was rampant. In response, the Ming imperial government imposed hygiene regulations, which banned all private and foreign maritime trade. In 1557, they also accepted Portugal from the ban on foreign trade, giving Portuguese merchants permission to settle Macau in exchange for protection against pirates. Despite the imperial government's efforts to curb piracy by banning foreign trade, smuggling persisted. Into the 17th century, the Spanish, Dutch, and British would enter the Chinese market. While Portuguese presence dominated Macau and nearby Guangzhou, other merchants were diverted to the more northerly ports in Fujian. During this period, ceramics, tea, and silk were the top Chinese commodities sought by Europe. The discovery of Chinese porcelain in peculiar archaeological contexts can often be attributed to European involvement. At Fort Jesus in Kenya, researchers have found a strange hodgepodge collection of Chinese ceramics ranging from Tang Dynasty polychrome Changsha pieces to late Ming, early Qing blue and white. Since sustained contact between China and Africa has never been established, explanation as to the source of this strange mix is traced back to the Southeast Asian middlemen warehouses, which store a large and indiscriminate volume of commodities. These pieces were brought to Africa by way of colonization by the Portuguese, whose network included posts in India and Indonesia. The Dutch were also major importers of Chinese porcelain. In still life paintings, blue and white feature heavily. During the Ming Gap, the shortage of Chinese porcelain led to imitative European production. In this period, the Dutch became famous for Delftware. While based on the same color scheme, Delftware is unique in its depiction of Dutch folk scenes. Throughout Europe, Chinese ceramics were so prized that they came to be known as Chinaware. One means through which cultural diffusion was achieved during this early modern global trade period was language, including specialized terms like Chinaware. As a result of contact, Chinese and China-related words became integrated into European vocabulary. One particularly interesting example is tea. Different European groups refer to tea with different names. Distinguishing this disparity is important as it reflects different trade patterns between China and the different European states. Tea is one of China's national products. the country's tea drinking tradition dates back to the Han Dynasty in the 3rd century BCE. In John Ramsay McCulloch's Dictionary of Commerce and Commercial Navigation, printed in 1837, he describes that conditions most congenial to the cultivation of tea are found in Fujian and Guangzhou. Incidentally, these regions also were the major ports conducting foreign trade during this early modern period. Europeans encountered the commodity in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. While the Portuguese were the first on record to have described the product, the Dutch East India Company is attributed with its popularization. After being introduced to the commodity by Chinese merchants in Java, the Dutch traded it with neighboring European countries, thus promulgating tea cultures throughout the continent. Today, tea is known by a phonologically similar name in most parts of Europe, except, as I will show, in Portugal. The nature of the Dutch encounter with the Chinese product helps explain the etymology of the word. By the 17th century, the Dutch had established a trading colony at Batavia in Java. Here, the merchants of the VOC commingled with a large Fujianese merchant community. Because Fujian and Guangzhou have different dialects, the two regions recognize tea by different names. In Fujian, where the Hokkien dialect is spoken, tea is called de, and in Guangzhou, where the Cantonese dialect is spoken, tea is called cha. Dutch and Portuguese words for tea differ. The Dutch word sounds like the Hokkien pronunciation, while the Portuguese word sounds more like the Cantonese pronunciation. Recalling the strongholds of each of their respective trade networks, this difference makes sense, corresponding with the dialect of the region where each country encountered the commodity. Tea is only one example of the linguistic convergence that occurred in early modern maritime trade. In terms of general language exchange, because European trade activity in China was focused in the South China Sea, many maritime-related words from this period and borrowed from Chinese are traced to Hokkien or Cantonese dialects, the languages with which Europeans had most contact. For example, sampan comes from the Cantonese word sampan, which means 3 planks, and is historically related to the original construction of boats. The pronunciations of coastal cities Amoy and Hokkien are derived from local rather than official Mandarin dialects. In Mandarin, Amoy would be Xiamen, and Hokkien would be Fujian. As Frank has observed, while the modern discourse on globalization is Eurocentric, in actuality, based on the scope, extent, and antiquity of Asiatic trade routes, as well as the centrality of Asian goods in initially driving the West's age of discovery, it is evident that indeed Asia and not Europe held center stage for most of early modern history. Therefore, the discourse must be reimagined to reflect a more integrative and holistic globological approach in analyzing the world economy.